In this video, I'll show you how I damage an otherwise awesome looking build. In a previous build, I made an automobile out of a World War II aircraft. That build was a lot of fun, so this time around, I'm going to turn a World War II jet fighter into a boat. To do that, I need this 1/32 scale kit of a Messerschmitt 262 from Trumpeter. And I'll tell you now that aircraft builders are going to hate me for what I'm going to do to this kit. I'll probably only use about 20% of it, and the rest will become greeblies to add to my stash. Effectively, all I'm only going to be using is the cockpit and fuselage from this highly detailed kit. The parts that I did use fitted together very quickly and easily with a touch of plastic cement. I won't be doing much modifications to the cockpit as I like the detail in there. Because I'm using just selected parts from the kit, I did need to jump around a bit with the instructions. Some of the parts I used ended up not being seen once it was completed. A quick coat of grey paint and some panel line highlighter to bring out some of the depth in the details. To highlight the raised detail, I used this dry brushing paint from Ammo and these brushes from Golden Maple. I lightly dabbed it into the thick paint and brushed off some of the excess, and then lightly brushed across the raised details. This technique really brings out the fine detail and brings it to life. I created these custom 2 figures with an online app called Titan Craft, and then just 3D printed them. To make them sit properly in the seats, I made some seat cushions out of a 2-part epoxy ribbon which hardens in around 5 to 10 minutes. This also just makes the figures look more natural and realistic in their seated positions. Next step was to mask up the cockpit, so when I glued it into place in the fuselage and then I painted the craft, I wouldn't get any overspray in the interior. Now, it was time to put the 2 halves of the fuselage together. And this is where I did run into some problems. Because this was essentially a kit bash, I didn't build a lot of the subframes, so when it came to assembling the fuselage, some of the panels didn't have anything to glue to, so I ended up having to make some tabs to solve this problem. With some of the parts, I just used masking tape to hold them in place while they dried. This seemed to work quite well and did the job as needed. Overall, none of this process was hard, just fiddly. The only issue I really had was the section under the cockpit, where the wheels are part of the bottom half of the wings, so I had to get a bit choppity-chop and modify that. Scoring and then snapping did the job. I then used my infamous 20-year-old tube of glue to hold it into place. Yes, I originally bought the Revel glue back in about 2000. It's old but still works. It's a bit like me. So far so good. The craft is coming together. Talking about tabs, the front wheel well needed some tabs for the wheel doors to stick to. I just used some scrap styrene to make those. Once that was all dry, the wing contact areas needed some filing to level them out. These leftover wings are from the converted aircraft to automobile build that I mentioned at the start of the video. They too needed to be glued and then held in place with some masking tape during the drying process. I used a bit of super glue to stick those Stuka wings to the fuselage, and this is where a third arm would have come in handy. I wanted to spray a bit of super glue kicker and had to wait for a few seconds for it to dry before I could use the spray. Unfortunately, this took a few goes because the wing quickly kept on falling off before I got the kicker onto it. I found these awesome pontoons on a free website called Thingiverse, and they were perfect for the build, but my first prints turned out to be way too small, so I needed to reprint them at almost double the size. It was worth the extra time because they turned out the perfect size that I needed. Here I'm masking an area off to protect the rivet detail before I start sanding the joint that I had filled with Tamiya putty off screen. I used 400 grit for the sanding and then the Dremel tool to cut off the ends of the wings to fit the pontoons. Then the trusty super glue to glue the pontoons onto the wings. I then chopped off the tail fin and leveled that down with a file. Next step was to mask up the clear parts of the canopy to prepare it for painting. This section always makes me nervous as I obviously don't want any paint to bleed under the masking tape, so I'm usually extra cautious at this step. For this, I'm using the 6mm Tamiya masking tape. It definitely pays off to spend a bit of extra time on masking and getting it right, as there is no second go at it with clear parts. Here I'm also masking the inside of the canopy to avoid any overspray making a mess. This is the primer that I will use for the fuselage, and the colour is Ghost Grey, and I'll need to airbrush a couple of coats to get and even finish. And not only does this prime the model, but it also shows the flaws that I missed during the sanding process. And yep, there were areas where I needed to go back in and resand to even out the joint lines. This time I used 800 grit to get a finer finish, and then another coat of the primer. My first coat of paint was the red from Vallejo Paints, and I made sure I got a nice even coat. I then added a drop of black to the airbrush pot and did a mottled covering of that colour to give it a more of an uneven finish to the paintwork to simulate weathered paint wear. Once that was dry, I masked off an area on the craft for another coat of primer to prepare it for the next colour to be painted, which will be Vallejo's Sun Yellow, and this too would get a mottled coat of a darker shade of the yellow. In this alternate world created by the testing of the atom bomb, the ice caps had melted and most of the land had disappeared. Earth had become a water world, and humans have had to adapt to this world's sparse of sweeping landscapes. Humans had no choice and had to learn to coexist and help each other. They had created floating cities and communities, families whose whole existence were allocated to ships, boats and barges. These family communities became very close due to the small distances they could travel. The world had become the old frontier, but with the lack of open land. Amongst all this, teenagers would always be teens. In their rebellious world, the custom cars and hot rods had become custom watercrafts. These crafts, with their personal paint jobs and insignias, were built from salvaged junk and modded to be the best and fastest on the lakes, rivers and oceans. Now back to the build. To create some of the custom insignias, I had a bit of a forage through my decal leftovers and then picked some that were interesting to the craft. I then transferred them to the craft, while keeping in mind it kind of had to look a bit hot roddy. Off camera, I gave the whole model a couple of coats of a clear matte finish to seal the decals and protect the paint from the next step, which is weathering. First thing I did was give it a liberal coat of a very thin brown wash, and I made sure this got in everywhere. You can never have too much wash. After the first pass was dry, off camera I did go in with a second pass. I then added some rust streaks by adding some thinned water paints and then creating the streak with a damp brush. I then went along with some rust colour and added some chipping to the corners. With the canopy painted with a primer and then a coat of flat black, I went in with dry brushing brush and brought out the detail with some gunmetal paint from ammo. Once that was completed on the 3 canopy pieces, I then used a larger brush from Golden Maple to dry brush the rest of the craft with lighter shades of both the red and the yellow. I put that aside and worked on the sensor array that I created from a bunch of greeblies. Now onto the base. Here I'm using some XPS foam and I'm working out the orientation for the craft. Once I'm happy with that, I then mark out the areas that I need to cut out so the craft looks like it sinks below the water level. To cut those areas out, I use a hot knife and caution. One must wear a mask, as not only are the fumes stinky, but they are also toxic. Mask is a must here. So far so good. Before I do anything else to the base, I need to seal it first, and for this I use PVA glue, also known as wood glue or craft glue. This gives it a nice protective coat and a better adhesion for the next step. To create a better fit for the pontoons, I'm using some of this plaster of Paris, which hardens very quickly and also creates another barrier between the casting resin and XPS foam. Resin and foam are not buddies. Using a flat brush, I evenly spread out the plaster of Paris across all of the foam. I covered the pontoons with cling film just to aid in the release once the plaster had dried. Like I said, plaster of Paris hardens very quickly, and in about 30 minutes the model was ready to pop out of the base, leaving a very nice cast of the pontoons. I mix a combination of green and black acrylic paint, and at the time I wanted to get a very dark and moody ocean, but with the power of hindsight I should have gone with a very dark blue. While I set the base aside to dry, it's time to add some cool details. Dolphins! I found these dudes on Thingiverse and then imported them into Chitterbox to get them ready to print. For my fine printing, my go-to 3D printer is the ELEGOO Mars 5 Ultra. When you initially start it up, it goes through a system check to make sure all is good, and then you can proceed with your printing. This printer has a 12K resolution screen, so it produces incredible detail. When you start up the print, it checks the level of resin in your vat, then does an auto level of the plate. The Mars 5, using its tilting vat system, starts to print. This tilting vat cuts the printing time in half with no loss of detail. In this case, the Dolphins were just under 6 hours to print in Chitterbox, but were printed in just over 3 hours in fast mode. I recently did a review of a couple of different ELEGOO printers, so go and check them out because they are awesome. With the Dolphins painted up, the base all dry, the acrylic surrounds glued to the sides of the foam with silicone, and I'm happy with the placement of the craft and Dolphins. It's time to pour some resin. This epoxy resin from Let's Resin is the deep pour type, which gives me the ability to pour up to 100mm in a single pour. That's 4 inches to the 3 countries still using the imperial system. This is mixed with a ratio of 2:1, which is 1 part resin to 2 parts activator. It's mixed by volume and not weight, so that means there is no need for scales. I just used a couple of marked clear cups, which I then poured into a larger container to mix with their mixing paddle, though they do also sell electric mixers on their website. The resin has virtually no smell, but please do use gloves when mixing and pouring. When mixing with the paddle, take your time, be very careful not to create bubbles to the resin. The resin is crystal clear, but I do need to add colour to the mix. I'm using some of this khaki coloured ink that was recommended to me by a craft shop, and I've used it before and it works well. You only need a few drops as the ink goes a long way. Once again, mix it very carefully till you get an even colour through the resin. You do have a fair bit of time before it starts to harden. A big thing I noticed with this resin is how few bubbles there were, and I only needed 1 pass with the blowtorch to remove some minor bubbling. After leaving it for a few days, I came back to a very hard resin ocean, and the opaqueness of it was very realistic. I did need a bit of force to remove those acrylic sides, and for the most part they came off cleanly. I was very impressed with the result of that resin pour. No bubbles whatsoever. I did need to shave down the edge, as all resin pours do create a lip at the edge. I just carefully used a box cutter for that job. To create some of the waves coming from the stern, I used a Dremel tool to grind away the resin. This made it look a lot more realistic rather than having the water level behind the pontoon. Resin dust is not a good thing to have floating around, so I did have a vacuum sucking up the dust. For the actual recreation of turbulent water, I'm using this crystal clear silicone, which is very thick and quite hard to squeeze out, but it does dry to a completely clear finish. During this process I ended up with a sore hand, and I'm not sure if it was due to being an old tube or just they simply make it that way. To spread the silicone, I'm using this stick that's been dipped in isopropyl alcohol, and that just stops it sticking to wood, makes the spreading of the silicone so much easier. This was working really well and the waves were looking great. This was a very effective and easy technique. I need to make some smaller ripples in the water, and after watching a couple of videos, I decided to make my own Mod Podge. Using some of this water-based clear gloss varnish and some PVA glue, and then mixing it in a 1:1 ratio, this should give me my cheaper Mod Podge variation. I mixed this by volume and not weight like I did with the resin, and I then gave it a thorough mixing. I then gave the surface of the resin a fairly thick coat of this mixture. This did take a little while to do, and to make it look more realistic, I then went in with an airbrush to create the ripples. That was also looking good, so to speed up the drying process, Off camera, I put it in front of a small heater as it's water based and it should dry quite fast. While I was waiting for the ripples to dry, I moved on to making that mast. I'm using brass rod and I designed this gizmo thingy to hold the mast, and boom, I think it's called a tack, but please, if you know the correct terminology, leave a comment in the comment section. If you haven't already, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel and share the video. Your support is what keeps me going. I gave the mast a coat of grey primer and then painted the tack black, and finally finishing it off with a dry brush of gunmetal. Of course, the mast and boom needs a sail, and I created this with some free vector art that I found online and then printed on plain paper, and also making sure it aligned on both sides. I then cut out the sail and used the Tamiya masking tape to create the connections between the sail and mast. Those were then painted a flat red. Off camera, I gave the whole thing a couple of spray coats of clear flat paint to seal and protect the artwork. I gave the sail a decent coat of thin brown wash to weather up the look. Even though I did seal the sail with the clear coat, I did get some minor warping in what was a taut sail. Not to worry, as it still looked great. And just as I was thinking, everything was going along great, I discovered that putting a completely sealed pair of pontoons that have no escape holes for the expanding hot air to escape is not a smart thing to do. The pontoon pretty much exploded and I ended up with this very nasty split. Luckily, the solution was simple, but I did lose half a day in repairing this Grand Canyon of a split. Lesson learned, I hope. A bit of super glue and putty solved the issue, and then some sanding to get it close to what it was, and then of course I had to try and match the paintwork as close as possible to the rest of the craft. Even the weathering had to match. With that all sorted out, it was on to painting the figures. I had ordered some much needed paints and then realised I had nowhere to put this as my paint stand was full. Lucky for me, I have a buddy who's currently putting together a range of modular paint stands, and he sent me a prototype to test out. To create this stand, I first needed to use my 50-watt CO2 OMTECH Polar 350 laser cutter. This thing has a 360-degree camera and cuts at an incredible 500mm per second. This laser cutter is just on a whole other level. I recently did a review on it, so you can check it out, and in this case for the test paint stand, I'm using a piece of 3mm basswood. Once I imported the file into Lightburn that comes with the laser cutter, I sent it straight to the cutter from the computer and off it went to do its thing. It took less than 10 minutes to cut the sheets required for this stand. The laser cuts in this timber have come up really crisp and clean, and now it was just a matter of carefully popping all the parts out of the board and then using some super glue to hold all the parts together. The assembly of the paint stand took about 10 minutes for me, and just like that I had heaps more room for my paints. When I paint my figures, I like to block in the base colours first and then add shading and details. I'm still working on my figure painting skills, and I'm slowly getting to the point where I'll be happy with my smaller scale figures. This particular figure is very close in what I created in my Battlestar Galactica Viper diorama, so check that out for more details on how I created the figure and pose. It's time to add more detail to the base of the diorama, and I'm going to use this cotton ball to create the froth of the turbulent waves. I stick that down with a brush and some very diluted PVA glue. This did take me a little while to do, and in retrospect I think I overdid the amount of frothing that I added. Most of that clear silicone disappeared under the cotton wool. It looks good, I just think it could have looked better. Another lesson learned. I don't know what happened here, but I seem to have inherited another crack. This time around, I'm going to fix this split with another product from Resin, and that's this bonding UV resin kit. It obviously comes with some resin and a rechargeable UV light. The resin bonding literally takes 5 seconds to harden, and I wish I had thought of using this for the first ginormous crack that I had. Man, that was an easy fix this time. Another lesson learned. Hopefully, with all the splits now fixed, it's now time to fit the rest of the components together. Well, okay then. I just cracked the fuselage with my over-enthusiasm to remove the masking tape. Luckily, I already had planned to put some gauges at that location, so all will be good. Bit of super glue to bring the two parts together, and also super duper glue for the two pilots. Now let's cover that cracked area with some gauges made from greeblies. I used a couple of tank pieces and part of a 50 cal machine gun, which I painted black, then dry brushed with gunmetal, and then glued it into place, giving the co-pilots some gauges connected to the sensor array at the stern. Time to remove the masking tape off the three canopy pieces. I first lift up a corner with an X-Acto knife, then pull the tape off with a pair of tweezers. I then use PVA glue to stick the canopies to the fuselage. PVA glue won't mark the clear plastic, and if you do get some of that glue on the clear part, you can easily wipe it off with a damp Q-tip. I add some black wash to the sensor array and then super glue the mast and sail to the fuselage. It's almost there, but there is another detail I need to add, and it's this cabley thingy thing that I've seen on the booms, and I haven't got a clue what it's called, but I do have a fair idea what it does, so again, leave me a comment if you know what it's called. This attachment makes the sail look like it just kinda may work. You have done well to stick around, so let's finally check out the hero clips. Even with all the disasters I had doing this build, I still had a lot of fun with it. A few lessons learned and a reminder that all my affiliate links are in the comments, and you could even save some bucks with the supplied discount codes. If you enjoyed watching this video, then check out these other two projects on my channel, and I'll see you at the next build.